May 9, 1945, Northern Germany. The air still carried the smoke of war, burnt villages, broken fuel depots, and the faint echo of artillery fading beyond the Elbe. In a muddy courtyard of a makeshift Allied internment camp, hundreds of German women stood in silence. Their hair tangled from sleepless nights, faces pale from hunger and disbelief. Many had once worn pressed gray uniforms, the insignia of the Reich's female auxiliaries, the Helferinnen. Now those same uniforms lay in piles before them. A British officer shouted an order. Translators repeated it sharply. "Throw them in." "Burn it all." The women hesitated. Some clutched at their tunics as if holding the last piece of themselves. Others obeyed immediately, their hands trembling as they fed the garments into the fire. Buttons hissed. The eagle crests blackened and curled in the flames. The smell of wool and smoke rose into the spring sky, a funeral pyre for a nation's illusion. For the first time, silence replaced the rhythm of marching boots, and behind that silence lay the story of who these women were, and how they arrived at this moment. In the early 1930s, Germany was a nation still bleeding from the wounds of the Great War. The Treaty of Versailles had humiliated it, stripped its pride, and left its people searching for meaning amid ruins and ration books. When Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, he did more than promise revival. He offered a myth, a dream of national rebirth. To millions, including young German women, it sounded like salvation. The Nazi regime did not only militarize men, it built an entire machinery of ideology that reached into classrooms, kitchens, and churches. Through the League of German Girls, Bund Deutscher Mädel, teenage girls were taught that service to the fatherland was sacred. Their duty was to nurture, to obey, to support the men who would conquer Europe. But as war expanded, that definition of service began to change. By 1939, when German troops marched into Poland, women found themselves called upon not only as mothers or nurses, but as vital cogs in the war machine. Tens of thousands volunteered for auxiliary service. They were radio operators, clerks, drivers, cryptographers, and signal officers, the Helferinnen, the helpers of the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe. Others joined the SS Auxiliary Corps, serving in concentration camp administration or intelligence offices. At first, they wore their uniforms with pride, gray or blue jackets tailored sharply, insignia glinting on their collars, caps bearing the eagle and swastika. For many, it symbolized purpose, belonging, and the illusion of equality. In a society that preached male dominance, the uniform made them visible, part of the national crusade. They were the faces behind the front, the unseen hands feeding the Nazi war effort with logistics, communication, and order. When the Blitzkrieg swept across Europe, these women worked in command posts from Norway to North Africa. In Berlin, women handled the teletype messages that coordinated invasions. In Paris, they typed daily reports for the Wehrmacht High Command. In Warsaw, they organized medical logistics and prisoner lists. Many saw themselves not as instruments of oppression, but as professionals serving their country. Few understood, or wanted to understand, the moral abyss into which that service led. The propaganda machine made sure of it. Newsreels depicted them smiling in crisp uniforms beside officers, guardians of discipline at the heart of the German miracle. Behind every soldier at the front, Goebbels declared, stood the loyal woman in uniform. As the war dragged on, the illusion began to fracture. By 1943, after the defeats at Stalingrad and El Alamein, Germany's armies were bleeding men faster than they could replace them. The front crept closer to home, and women were drafted into roles once reserved for men. They staffed anti-aircraft batteries, ran communications for field units, and helped man radar stations that tracked Allied bombers. Some were stationed at concentration camps like Ravensbrück or Auschwitz, where female overseers enforced discipline among prisoners. Others worked in administrative offices of the SS, processing transport lists, ration quotas, or death certificates, small bureaucratic tasks that together sustained the machinery of genocide. Many later claimed ignorance. Some believed it. Others simply refused to see. As 1945 approached, defeat was no longer a rumor. It was an inevitability. Allied bombers turned German cities into skeletal ruins. Roads were choked with refugees, soldiers, and the broken fragments of an empire that once promised to last 1,000 years. In Berlin, women clerks typed until the very last day, recording orders from command centers that no longer existed. In the north, in places like Flensburg, Kiel, and Lübeck, female staff of the Wehrmacht and SS retreated alongside their superiors, hoping to surrender to the British rather than fall into Soviet hands. Many still wore their uniforms proudly, unaware that those same garments would soon mark them as criminals in the eyes of the victors. When Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945, millions of women in uniform found themselves suddenly stripped of purpose and protection. Their officers were gone. Their insignia, once symbols of power, had become emblems of guilt. The Allies moved quickly to disarm and intern all personnel associated with the German military apparatus, not only soldiers but also nurses, secretaries, and clerks. Camps were established in former military sites, schools, and open fields. Here, men and women alike waited for interrogation, classification, and, for many, shame. For the British and Americans, these women represented more than just auxiliaries. They were living fragments of the Nazi state. Some had been indoctrinated from youth, some complicit in atrocities, and others merely caught in uniform by circumstance. Yet the Allies feared the symbolic power that still lingered in those garments. The Reich had fallen, but its symbols, the eagle, the swastika, the uniforms, still carried the power to rally belief. To rebuild Germany, the victors needed to erase that image completely. Thus, in many camps, orders were issued. All Nazi insignia, uniforms, and badges were to be confiscated or destroyed. For the women, it felt like a ritual of humiliation. Many had been trained to see their uniforms as second skin, as proof of dignity and duty. Now they were told to destroy them. Some British officers allowed them to strip insignia before burning the cloth. Others demanded the entire uniform be thrown in the flames. It was not cruelty, it was symbolism. The war had ended not only in military defeat, but in ideological annihilation. Burning the uniforms meant burning the Reich itself. Witnesses described long lines of German women standing before bonfires of fabric, the smoke rising like a dark requiem over the ruins of Europe. For some, it was an act of liberation, the shedding of a lie. For others, it was unbearable shame. We had believed in something, one former Luftwaffe clerk later recalled, and now even the clothes that gave us purpose were condemned. In those moments, ideology met reality, and faith turned to ash. But the story of these women did not begin or end with that fire. To understand their tears and silence in May 1945, one must look back at what they believed they were serving, the dream that had deceived them and the machinery that had consumed them. It was not only the fall of a nation, it was the unraveling of an identity built on obedience and illusion. In the days that followed, the camps filled with the sounds of order being replaced by emptiness, the clatter of boots replaced by quiet footsteps on mud, the language of command replaced by murmurs of disbelief. Among the prisoners, the women auxiliaries stood apart, neither soldiers nor civilians, stripped of both pride and belonging. They had carried messages across Europe, calculated troop movements, encoded commands, and now they stood waiting, nameless, faceless, watching the symbols of their past burn. The flames that consumed their uniforms would soon give rise to deeper questions about guilt, responsibility, and what it meant to serve evil without recognizing it. And it is within that silence, amid the ash and uncertainty, that the true complexity of their story begins to unfold. They stood there, hundreds of them, in rows that had once been formations. The same women who once marched to the sound of drums now shuffled barefoot on cold ground, their gray skirts muddied, their eyes hollow. The war was over, yet something in them still resisted the truth. For years they had lived in a world built on symbols, banners, oaths, songs. The uniform had been their armor and identity, and without it many did not know who they were anymore. When the order came to burn it, some cried, some laughed bitterly, and others stared into the fire with an emptiness that frightened even the Allied guards. In those first days after Germany's surrender, the emotional landscape of the defeated was chaotic. Men spoke of lost comrades and betrayed leaders. But for the women, defeat was more personal, an internal collapse. They had served in hospitals, command centers, and communications posts. They had typed every message that sent soldiers to the front. They were the witnesses behind the machinery of war. Yet now the world saw them not as patriots or helpers, but as accomplices. The Allies saw uniforms, and uniforms meant guilt. For many of these women, That simple logic would rewrite their lives. Not all of them had believed. Some had joined out of necessity. By 1944, Germany was starving, cities were in ruins, and the army needed every hand it could find. To join the Helferinnenkorps meant a bed, food, and safety from forced labor. But others had volunteered willingly, filled with the conviction that they were serving the future of their people. Indoctrination was subtle. It came through school lectures, propaganda films, the smiling faces of female officers who promised honor and service. For many young women, especially those raised under Nazi education, the uniform was not a symbol of hate. It was a symbol of worth in a nation that otherwise dismissed their independence. Now, as they stood stripped of insignia, watching the bonfires devour the fabric, their belief began to disintegrate. The physical act of burning the uniform was not just about surrender. It was psychological destruction. The Allies understood that power. The sight of flames consuming the eagle emblem was as much a warning as it was an order. There would be no resurrection of the Reich, no secret pride to cling to. To rebuild Europe, they would first erase its old skin. One British officer, in his post-war report, described the scene at a camp near Lübeck. They were lined before the pyres, secretaries, nurses, clerks, and the fire reflected in their eyes. Some wept openly, some whispered the old songs. When told to step forward, a few refused, clutching their coats. But when the flames touched the fabric, even the most defiant went silent. It was not a public spectacle. There was no triumph in the air, no cheering, no vengeance. Just the sound of burning cloth, the smell of sweat and smoke, and the quiet realization that the world they knew was gone. For the Allies, especially the British and Americans, this was more than symbolic cleansing. They faced the challenge of identifying who among the millions of German POWs bore true responsibility. Women in uniform complicated that process. They had served in roles that blurred the lines between civilian and combatant. Many had signed confidentiality oaths, worked directly under SS command, or handled communications that linked to war crimes. But others had done nothing more than type memos or clean offices. To interrogators, they all looked the same: gray uniforms, polite discipline, the same rehearsed words. We only followed orders. In interviews, Allied intelligence officers often remarked on the calm of these women. They were trained in restraint. When questioned about Nazi ideology, they spoke mechanically, as if repeating lessons learned by heart. Few expressed open regret. Many clung to the belief that their duty had been apolitical. "I did my job," one former Luftnachrichtenhelferin, Air Force signal operator, told a British officer. "I wasn't a soldier. I didn't shoot anyone." Yet her transmissions had guided bomber squadrons that leveled entire towns. Guilt was a spectrum. But in 1945, the world had no patience for shades of gray. For the women themselves, the psychological dissonance was immense. Inside, they carried both pride and shame. They had lived through bombings, hunger, and fear, and had believed they were part of something heroic. Now they were told it was all monstrous. The bonfire was the physical manifestation of that contradiction, the death of self-image. Some threw their uniforms in with relief, as if ridding themselves of a curse. Others hesitated until guards forced them forward. A few attempted to hide parts of their uniform: a cap, a sleeve, a medal, mementos of the past they weren't ready to let go of. Later, those small tokens would become evidence in interrogations. Among them were women from every walk of life. In one camp, former SS auxiliaries stood beside telephone clerks from the Wehrmacht. Their experiences could not have been more different. The SS women, many from concentration camp staffs, faced hatred even from their fellow prisoners. They were shunned, whispered about, sometimes attacked. They were the true believers, recalled a nurse interned in the same camp. We looked at them and saw what we might have become. The Allied guards made no distinction at first. All wore the same gray, all burned their uniforms alike. Only later, through meticulous questioning and documentation, would their paths diverge. Some released, others sent to trial. The symbolism of the burned uniforms rippled beyond the camps. For German civilians who saw the smoke rise over nearby fields, it was the visual proof of collapse. The Reich that had once wrapped its citizens in banners and uniforms was dissolving into ash. Women who had once marched through their towns as symbols of order now stood disheveled and defeated. In the eyes of many Germans, they represented the final humiliation. not only for the military but for the national image of discipline itself. Yet to others, their burning of the uniforms was necessary penance. "It was right," wrote a German diarist in June 1945. "The fire took what pride had hidden." Inside the camps, conversations were whispered and fragmented. Some women still defended the regime, insisting that Hitler had been betrayed, that victory was stolen. Others confessed confusion and disbelief. A young telephonist from Dresden, barely 20 years old, was heard asking another, "If everything was wrong, why did they teach us it was right?" That question would echo for decades, as an entire generation of Germans tried to reconcile personal loyalty with national crime. But in 1945, there was no philosophy, only hunger, silence, and the smell of smoke. The Allied officers tasked with processing the prisoners understood the psychological importance of control. The women's compliance in burning their uniforms became an early test of cooperation. Those who resisted were marked as potential hardliners. Those who complied were seen as redeemable. Behind the practical order lay a deeper message. The uniform was not just fabric. It was ideology made visible. To destroy it was to begin dismantling that ideology. In later testimonies, many of the women described the burning not as punishment, but as purification. One wrote in her diary, "I watched the flames eat the last thing that made me proud. I felt hollow but clean, as if the smoke carried away my shame." Another recalled a sense of surreal detachment. "It was as if we were watching the past die in front of us, but we could not feel the future yet." In their words, one hears both remorse and bewilderment. A generation caught between complicity and disillusionment. Outside the camp fences, Germany itself was being stripped of symbols. Flags were torn down, swastikas erased from walls, statues toppled. Allied directives banned Nazi imagery under threat of imprisonment. The process mirrored what was happening inside the camps. The deliberate erasure of everything that tied the people to their former identity. For women who had built their lives around obedience, that erasure felt like being unmade. Their sense of purpose had come from structure and belonging. Now both were gone. In a world without orders, they were left to confront themselves. There was also another angle, the moral gaze of the victors. Allied troops, many of them barely older than the women they guarded, looked at them with a mixture of disgust and fascination. Some pitied them. Others saw them as symbols of hypocrisy, the so-called good German women who had smiled through genocide. For these soldiers, forcing them to burn their uniforms was not vengeance but justice. Yet even among the guards, some were unsettled. "They looked like ghosts," wrote an American sergeant after watching a group of female POWs in Hanover. "We'd won, but I couldn't feel proud. It was like punishing shadows." In that quiet gray spring of 1945, Europe was learning how to live with ghosts. The bonfires that consumed the Nazi uniforms were not just about victory. They were about cleansing, a moral act disguised as a military order. But history would not burn as easily as cloth. In the ashes lay the questions that would haunt post-war Germany. What did it mean to serve evil without seeing it? Was obedience innocence? Could belief itself be guilt? The women stood in silence as the last uniforms turned to smoke. The fires died, leaving only ash on the wind. Some turned away, some stared until the embers dimmed. For a long time, no one spoke. The guards ordered them back to their barracks, and the courtyard emptied, footprints already fading in the dust. But that night, long after curfew, one could still smell the fire in the air, a bitter reminder of everything that had been lost, and everything that would need to be remembered. The moment would linger in memory, not as a single act of surrender, but as the beginning of reckoning, the turning point when symbols fell and human faces remained. It began with silence, the kind that exists only after a nation stops breathing. Dawn spread pale light over the camp near Lübeck. A thin mist rolled in from the fields, settling between the rows of wooden huts and the barbed wire fences. Inside, hundreds of German women woke to the clang of a metal bell. They rose from straw mattresses, their faces gray with exhaustion, their hands trembling from cold and hunger. The war was over, but their captivity had only just begun. The British commandant arrived shortly after sunrise. Behind him, a jeep loaded with wooden crates and fuel drums. Guards took their positions, rifles slung across their shoulders, their expressions unreadable. A translator, a young woman from Belgium, stepped forward and unrolled a piece of paper. The words she read would echo through the rest of the morning. All Nazi military garments and insignia are to be destroyed immediately. No exceptions. A ripple of confusion passed through the crowd. Some whispered. Others stared blankly as if the words had no meaning. The translator repeated slower this time. You will gather your uniforms and every jacket, every cap, every armband, and bring them to the yard. You will burn them under supervision. There was no applause, no anger, no sound but the shuffling of boots on gravel. The women obeyed quietly. They had been trained for obedience, and even in defeat the instinct remained. They returned to their bunks, opened their duffel bags, and unfolded what was left of their lives. Gray tunics still marked with sweat, skirts mended in haste, medals wrapped in handkerchiefs. Some smoothed the fabric gently as if it were the skin of a fallen friend. Others tore badges from the sleeves, slipping them into their pockets, small acts of defiance or memory. By mid-morning, the courtyard had filled. The bonfire stood ready, a mound of splintered wood soaked in gasoline. The commandant gave a nod and a soldier struck a match. The flame took quickly, hissing upward, devouring the kindling until smoke curled thick and black against the sky. One by one, the women were called forward. Throw it in. The first was a nurse from Hamburg. She hesitated, clutching the uniform she had worn for 5 years, its sleeves stained with iodine and ash. Then with a trembling hand she tossed it into the fire. The flame swallowed it instantly and the crowd fell silent. The next stepped forward and the next. Each gesture became heavier, slower, as if the act itself demanded a confession. When the fire grew high, the heat pressed against their faces. Buttons snapped in the flames. The insignia melted, running like liquid metal. Smoke filled the air with the sour scent of wool and oil and fear. Some of the women turned away, covering their mouths. Others stood rigid, eyes locked on the fire, their expressions caught between disbelief and grief. A British officer watched from a distance, arms folded. He had seen battlefields littered with the dead, but this scene unsettled him more. It was the end of something deeper than war, he would later write in his report. It was the death of belief. In another camp near Kiel, a similar ritual unfolded. The women were ordered to pile their uniforms in the center of the field. This time it was an American officer who oversaw the destruction. We do not leave symbols of tyranny standing, he told them through a translator. The women obeyed, though not all in silence. Some argued that their uniforms were proof of service, not guilt. A few cried out that they had done nothing wrong. The officer gave no reply. The fire would answer for him. One of the women, a signal operator named Liesel, later recalled the moment with haunting clarity. It was not the uniform that burned, she wrote in her post-war journal. It was my youth. I had believed in a world that no longer existed, and when I saw the cloth turn to ash, I felt as though I, too, was disappearing. For the women who had served in the SS Auxiliary Corps, the order carried an even deeper terror. Their uniforms bore the black insignia that now meant death. Many had already been separated for questioning, suspected of crimes in the camps, but a few remained in the general population, hoping anonymity would save them. When they were told to burn their uniforms, they did so without a word. To keep them would be suicide. As the flames rose, the black wool turned to gray dust, the runes curling into nothing. By noon, the fires across the camps were burning high enough to be seen for miles. To passing civilians, the smoke looked like another bombing raid. But this time it was not cities that burned, it was memory. Allied photographers recorded some of the scenes, though few of the images were ever published. They showed women standing in lines, heads bowed, the fire reflecting in their eyes. No captions were needed. The war's defeat had finally reached the human soul. Inside the camp fences, the atmosphere changed. Something broke in the silence after the burning. The women no longer stood with their backs straight. Their movements slowed. Their conversations fell into whispers. For years they had been part of something vast and unquestioned, a state, a cause, a rhythm of command. Now, with nothing left to follow, they felt the weight of isolation for the first time. One British psychologist attached to the camp noticed it immediately. When the uniforms were gone, he wrote, their posture changed. They became smaller, uncertain. It was as if the absence of the uniform exposed the person beneath, vulnerable, frightened, and unsure of her own identity. That afternoon, after the fire had cooled, the guards ordered them to collect the ashes. Metal insignia, belt buckles, and buttons that had survived the heat were gathered into buckets. The women were told to bury them outside the perimeter fence. A few knelt in the dirt, digging shallow graves for what had once defined them. No prayers were said, no farewells, only the scrape of metal against soil. Among the women there were still whispers of loyalty. Some claimed that the Führer would rise again, that Germany would reclaim its honor. Others called them fools. The arguments were brief, fading into the exhaustion of captivity. Hunger silenced ideology faster than any speech. By evening, most sat in their huts, staring at their hands, bare now, no longer gloved in gray fabric, no longer belonging to anyone but themselves. For the Allied soldiers who witnessed it, the day remained etched in memory. Many of them were barely in their 20s, too young to understand the vast machinery of the war they had just ended. To them, the women seemed fragile, almost pitiful, and yet they represented the system that had burned Europe. It was strange, one American private wrote home. They looked like ordinary women, but when they threw those uniforms in, it felt like they were burning more than clothes. They were burning faith, twisted, dangerous faith. That night, the fires finally died out. The ashes scattered with the wind, carried across fields already heavy with spring rain. Somewhere beyond the camp, the bells of a ruined church tolled for the first time in months. The sound drifted over the barracks, faint and hollow, echoing off the walls of a world learning to live again. In the dim light of the huts, the women lay awake. Some cried quietly. Others stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The smell of smoke lingered in their hair, their clothes, their skin. It would not leave for days. For some, it never left at all. In the morning, they were given civilian garments, ill-fitting dresses, coats scavenged from supply depots, anything to cover the emptiness left by the destroyed uniforms. The transformation was complete. Where once had stood the women of the Reich, now stood refugees of ideology, stripped of nation, of cause, of self. The act of burning had done more than end a chapter. It had exposed the raw question that Germany itself would face in the years to come. What remained when identity was built on obedience, and obedience turned to ash? As the days passed, interrogations began. Allied officers questioned the women about their roles, their loyalties, their knowledge. Some spoke freely, others stayed silent. The fire had burned the cloth, but not the memories it carried. Each testimony revealed fragments of a society where faith had replaced morality, where uniforms had turned ordinary people into instruments of a machine they barely understood. The Allied command considered the ritual a success. It had broken the illusion. No more gray lines, no more marching figures. The fire had reduced the symbols of power to nothing but dust and regret. Yet in private moments, some officers wondered what those ashes meant to the people who had created them. Could belief be unlearned? Could guilt be buried with a uniform? The camp quieted as summer approached. Gardens began to grow in the ruined soil, planted by the same women who had once filed reports and coded messages. Their hands, once disciplined to type and salute, now tilled earth. The past still hung in the air like smoke, but life, slow, uncertain, had begun to return. Still every evening, as the sun set behind the fences, the ashes glimmered faintly beneath the soil. They were a reminder that the war had not simply ended. It had left its shadow in every human being who had believed, obeyed, and survived. And as Germany began its long road toward reckoning, the memory of that day, the day when women in uniform were ordered to burn their second skin, would remain one of the quietest, most haunting funerals in history. When the fires burned out, a new kind of silence took hold. Not the silence of fear, but the stunned quiet of realization. The uniforms were gone, the flags vanished, and the Reich that had promised eternity lay in ruins. Yet for the women who had once worn its symbols, the end was only beginning. The surrender had stripped them of their roles, but it had not yet given them absolution. Across the shattered landscape of post-war Germany, the question hung heavy in the air. What had they been part of? The Allied occupation began with procedure, the slow machinery of de-Nazification. Every captured soldier, officer, nurse, and clerk was subject to classification: major offender, lesser offender, follower, or exonerated person. For women, the process was often confusing and inconsistent. They were interrogated by officers who struggled to understand the layers of loyalty and indoctrination that had shaped their service. Some women were released within weeks. Others spent years in detention, trapped between guilt and the bureaucracy of rebuilding. The de-Nazification questionnaires, known as Fragebogen, became symbols of post-war reckoning. Each sheet of paper contained hundreds of questions. Were you a member of the NSDAP? Did you serve in an organization affiliated with the Wehrmacht or SS? Did you wear a uniform? Those who admitted to service in auxiliary corps were immediately marked for further review. For many of the Helferinnen, that single checked box, yes, served, was enough to change their lives. At camps like Neuengamme and Fallingbostel, the British held thousands of German women for months of investigation. Interrogators asked about their roles, what offices they worked in, what orders they had handled, who they had reported to. The women's answers blurred together. I was a typist, I did not know, I followed orders. Many were telling the truth, others were hiding behind it. The difficulty for the Allies was that guilt in the Nazi system was not always visible in blood, but in paper. The typist who filed a death list was as integral to atrocity as the officer who signed it. By late 1945, Allied intelligence officers began to separate the harmless from the dangerous. Those found to have served in purely administrative or communication roles were gradually released, though their names were recorded and their movements monitored. Women affiliated with the SS or concentration camps were held for trial. In places like Belsen and Dachau, female guards and administrators faced justice in proceedings that would mark a turning point in modern war crimes law. The Belsen trial in 1945 exposed the world to an image it had never seen before: women, young and ordinary in appearance, standing accused of murder and torture. Irma Gries, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and others became symbols of the regime's cruelty. The press called them the Beast of Belsen, the Beautiful Fiend. Their calm demeanor in court terrified the public, the quiet contrast between femininity and horror. But most of the female auxiliaries never saw a courtroom. Their guilt was quieter, their punishment more subtle: social exile, silence, and the slow erosion of identity. In the British and American zones of occupation, women released from camps faced a society that did not want them back. Germany itself was a ghost. Cities in ruins, families scattered, hunger gnawing at every street. Returning home in civilian clothes, they found their former neighbors wary, even hostile. The uniform they had burned was not the only thing lost. Their pasts were ashes, their futures uncertain. Employers refused to hire them. Churches hesitated to welcome them. Even within families, silence replaced conversation. Fathers did not ask, mothers did not comfort, children did not understand. The post-war years became a long reckoning without words. Many of the Helferinnen buried their memories, pretending their service had been clerical, unimportant. A few reinvented themselves entirely, moving to new towns, changing names. Others married quickly, seeking normalcy, as if domestic life could erase what had come before. But trauma does not dissolve in silence. It lingers in gestures and in the way they avoided mirrors, in how they flinched at the sound of commands, in the nightmares that followed them for decades. Psychologists, studying the generation later, observed a peculiar phenomenon: the displacement of guilt. These women often described themselves as victims of propaganda, of circumstance, of male authority. To them, their suffering in POW camps, their hunger and their humiliation, replaced the moral weight of what they had served. They did not deny the crimes of the regime, but they separated themselves from them, retreating into the language of obedience. We didn't know. We were young. We did what we were told. Yet some began to question that narrative. In the late 1940s, as the Nuremberg trials concluded and the enormity of the Holocaust became public, a few former auxiliaries confessed to a deep, haunting sense of complicity. They had not killed, but they had watched. They had seen the trains. They had processed names. They had chosen not to ask questions. "We lived beside evil," wrote one former communications clerk in a letter to a friend in 1948, "and we called it duty." The Allied powers, meanwhile, continued their mission to dismantle Nazism from the German psyche. Propaganda posters appeared across towns. "This is your guilt." Films showing the liberation of concentration camps were screened for civilians and former military personnel. In one camp near Hamburg, a group of female POWs was shown footage from Bergen-Belsen. Eyewitness accounts described the women sitting in silence, tears streaming down their faces. Some turned away. Others refused to believe it was real. The human mind, trained for years to accept only one version of truth, could not adjust overnight. In the years that followed, as Germany divided into East and West, the memory of these women faded into the margins of history. The new German governments had little interest in revisiting the moral complexity of female participation. In East Germany, the narrative was clear. Fascism was the disease of the capitalist West. Women were to be rebuilt as workers, not judged as former collaborators. In the West, silence prevailed. The economic miracle needed unity, not guilt. For decades, former Helferinnen blended into the anonymous tide of post-war recovery. Still, the shadow remained. In interviews conducted in the 1980s and 1990s, surviving women described the moment they burned their uniforms as the most vivid memory of their lives. "It was the only time I cried for the Reich," said one. Not for Hitler, not for victory, for the belief that we had meant something. Another described the smell of the fire following her for years. "Every time I burned trash in the garden, I saw it again." The gray cloth, the smoke, the silence. Their stories reveal a deeper tragedy. Not only the crimes of a regime, but the way it consumed ordinary lives, especially women's, through faith disguised as service. The uniforms they had burned were not just clothing. They were symbols of a world that told them obedience was virtue, loyalty was purity, and questioning was betrayal. When those ideals turned to ash, the collapse was not only political, it was spiritual. In post-war Germany, few wanted to speak about women's roles in Nazism. The focus remained on male generals, politicians, and SS officers. But behind the scenes, women had been the secret infrastructure of the Reich. They had run communications networks, managed supply chains, documented deportations, and sustained morale on the home front. The fire that destroyed their uniforms did not destroy that truth. It lingered in archives, in letters, in the silence of families who never asked. For those who tried to rebuild their lives, normalcy became a kind of penance. They lived quietly, worked modest jobs, raised children, and avoided questions. Some joined post-war humanitarian efforts seeking redemption through service. A few became outspoken pacifists, dedicating their lives to ensuring that obedience would never again replace conscience. But most remained silent until old age loosened their tongues. Only then did they begin to speak, not to justify, but to understand. The world around them moved on. New wars came, new generations rose. Yet for those who had watched their uniforms burn in 1945, that image remained the dividing line between who they had been and who they became. In the ashes of that fire lay the fragments of belief, identity, and the endless question of guilt. Reports from Allied observers noted something remarkable in the months after the burnings. Discipline among female prisoners disintegrated rapidly. They stopped saluting, stopped marching, stopped referring to each other by rank. The loss of uniform had stripped away hierarchy. For the first time, they spoke as individuals, hesitant, uncertain, human. In the vacuum left by obedience, self-awareness began to grow. It was painful, uneven, but real. Germany itself would undergo the same transformation. The nation that had once dressed itself in symbols learned slowly to live without them. The act that began in POW camps, the destruction of uniforms, insignia, and emblems, became a national process of purification. By erasing the outer forms of power, the Allies forced a reckoning with the inner conscience. It did not heal quickly, but it planted the seed of a different kind of patriotism, one grounded not in obedience but in responsibility. For the women, life eventually became quieter. They grew old and the past faded from conversation. Yet in private moments, in the scent of smoke, in the sound of marching feet on film reels, memory returned. Some spoke of it with regret, others with an unspoken relief that they had survived it all. Few ever forgot the order that had changed everything. Throw it in. Burn it all. That command had done what decades of ideology could not. It had forced them to see the truth in firelight. And as Germany rebuilt itself from ruin, those ashes became the foundation of remembrance, fragile, gray, and enduring. The story of those women does not end with the burning. It continues in what they carried afterward, the silence, the questions, the slow realization that history is not something that happens to people, but something they become part of. It is from that quiet understanding that the reflection begins. The smoke had long drifted away, but its shadow remained. In every life touched by that fire, something irreversible had happened, not only to a nation, but to the human spirit itself. The women who once stood in uniform, proud and certain, were now scattered across the ruins of Europe, anonymous in plain clothes. Yet in the quiet of their later years, many came to understand what the flames had truly consumed. It was not fabric, not metal, not even allegiance. It was illusion. The illusion that obedience could ever be innocence. History often remembers war in the language of men, generals, battles, victories, defeats. But beneath that noise lies another story, one told in whispers, in diaries, in the trembling of hands that once typed orders they didn't question. The burning of those uniforms was more than a symbolic act of surrender. It was a moment of truth, when the facade of power gave way to the fragility of conscience. For the first time, those who had lived inside the machinery of ideology stood outside it and saw it for what it was, a lie built on fear and faith. The world that rose from the ashes of 1945 was quieter, humbler. Germany learned, painfully, that strength without morality is hollow, and that even the smallest act of service to tyranny leaves a mark on the soul. The women who once stood before the fire carried that mark for the rest of their lives, not as punishment but as memory. Some found peace in silence, others in speaking at last, but all in their own way bore witness to the truth that no uniform, no flag, no anthem can ever cleanse. The flames that consumed their past became the light by which the world saw itself anew. In those ashes lay a warning and a lesson, that the most dangerous loyalty is blind belief, and that redemption begins only when the uniform burns, and a person finally stands alone, unmasked, and human again.